I'm Elsa Youngsteadt. I am a faculty in the Department of Applied Ecology at NC State, and the focus of my lab is urban ecosystems, and especially plant-insect interactions in cities. It, opened up as a really interesting and relatively new field of inquiry that seemed like it, had leads, and I wanted to stay and follow up in. The conversion of land that was either previously natural or previously agricultural to, built, developed areas with a high population density. And when you get down to the nitty-gritty of mapping out on the planet, where's the boundary between urban and not urban, it's almost always a little blurry. It's a continuum, but urbanization is then, the process of moving from those undeveloped areas to places where there's buildings, there's people, there's economic activity that depends on things other than agriculture. There's a service economy. And once all of those things have happened, then you've got urban. I think the thing that I find fascinating, that actually really conjures that feeling of fascination in my spirit, is what I don't know. It's not what I have learned, but it's looking out at the city and being how do you, insect, get from here to here? How do you make a living here? How do you use this, this landscape? And so once I've actually done a study and gone through the slog of collecting the data and analyzing the data and finding some kind of conclusion, it feels less fascinating. Because then that's answered, and it's the next question that's more interesting. So looking back at what have I learned, by the time I've learned it, it all feels sort of obvious and no longer fascinating. So one of the, an example of something that felt obvious in retrospect, but might have been fascinating beforehand, and actually turned out to be fascinating to apparently the rest of the world, was actually a project I did several years ago when I was a postdoc. But we were working in New York City at the time and wanting to know sort of how ants contribute to that urban ecosystem. And one of the things we wanted to know is how much sort of human food garbage do they actually consume? And okay, we've known for centuries that ants show up at picnics and eat our crumbs, right? So it seems super obvious, but at the same time, the question hadn't really been asked ecologically, hadn't really been measured. And so yeah, we went out and put, human food trash in different sites around Manhattan and measured how much of it got eaten by ants and other insects. It does feel sort of obvious, of course they're doing that function. But then that paper that we published based on those results, got covered in the New York Times and National Geographic, dozens of news outlets all over the world, which in itself became kind of meta-fascinating. How is it actually news that ants eat crumbs? And yet it was. I think part of it may be that ecological research, quantitative ecology, is really moving into cities fairly recently. So it may be a fairly intriguing idea to a lot of the world that these ecological processes are actually going on right around us, in our own backyard, in our own park. It's not something that's way distant that you have to go off to some remote field station to study or something. It's everywhere. I would say it is, for a couple of reasons. Not necessarily that we need every single insect species to be living with us in our cities, but cities in a lot of ways exemplify environmental trends that are happening the world over, even outside of cities. Cities are hotter, they have fragmented habitats, they have certain air pollutants. And if those are the things that are driving diversity declines in cities, that doesn't bode well for even the non-urban diversity in the future if those same things are happening worldwide, just less intensely than in cities. But it's also, I think, an opportunity to learn. If we think about cities as these little environmental pressure cookers, if if we can figure out how to support a higher biodiversity in these systems and to do conservation in places where lots of people live, then we're kind of starting to get ahead of the game and maybe learn things that would also be useful on the other 97% of the Earth's surface that's not in a city. My favorite completed urban bee study that I've been involved in was actually one that was a master's project led by April Hamblin, when she was a master's student at NC State in a lab where I was a postdoc. And her research question was looking at bees across an urban warming gradient in Raleigh. Our prediction was that bees who have a higher physiological tolerance from heat, as you measure it in the lab just as a physiological property of the bee, should also be more resilient to urban warming in the field. And that was indeed what we found, where bees with the highest heat tolerance in the lab also had the most stable populations across the whole urban warming gradient, whereas the bees with the lowest heat tolerance had populations that declined pretty precipitously in the hottest parts of Raleigh, but still did fine in the coolest parts of the city. So that was a pretty fascinating project, both because the question to me was really interesting, both as a global change question and as an urban question, and then the fact that it actually, we saw the predicted patterns, even though there was so much room for noise. Like, there's so much else going on in a city besides just the temperature, and yet we did get this effect of temperature on bee communities. And we're continuing to work much more on urban bees, so I think there's a lot more that's like ongoing and unknown besides things that, I've previously learned in urban bee research that I've been involved in. Another question that I would love to get at is this issue of bee movement through cities, like what actually constitutes a barrier. A lot of times urban bee research just sort of has a study site and then draws a circle around it. It's like 1,000 meters from here is where bees, could be. Like, this is the environment that could influence the bees at this site. But we know that they're not moving like an equal distance in all directions. They may go farther in some ways where the habitat is great. They may go less far in other ways where they hit a barrier. And I would love to understand more about how they actually move through the maze that is a city. I think in some ways that's something we're still learning a lot about. I think the things that are very clear are also maybe a little bit obvious, but like very, vast extents of impervious surface without any vegetation or without any native vegetation are environments where very few other organisms can live. They don't support a lot of diversity. And so it's also pretty clear that whenever you add green space, and the bigger that green space is, the more species you're going to support, the more robust ecological functions you're going to support. Things I think we know less about. A lot of times when we're looking at effects of urbanization on biodiversity, a lot of times we'll pick we, meaning like urban researchers in general, will pick like one consistent habitat, like one species of tree or a forest fragment or something, and look at that habitat when it's embedded in a more urban area versus a less urban area. And you always see decline, almost always, or maybe sometimes a suburban peak followed by decline in diversity when you do that study design. But cities are not homogeneous. They have lots of different little habitats. So if you look at that one species of tree, maybe you see a decline in diversity in the city. But if you took into account all of the different habitats in the city, how would that compare to your reference forest or something? When you actually, so how the diversity accumulates across different urban habitats and how much that makes up for the loss in diversity in any one habitat is something that I think we don't have a great sense of yet, and that I think would be useful to know for understanding how urban areas can contribute to conservation. So we've got projects looking at how socioeconomic status affects habitat, affects biodiversity of insects, looking at how urban warming affects sort of distribution and foraging movements of ants, looking at how different urban habitats support just total insect biomass. We've also got a few more practical projects going on, for example, looking at carpenter bees and how people might manage them in a more ecologically friendly way in their decks rather than, hosing the whole deck with, insecticides. And then of course there's a whole project looking at how, what lives in tree canopies and how does that differ between urban and less disturbed areas. We already know from that previous project that I mentioned that certain pollinators don't tolerate urban warming very well, but now we want to know, how does it actually affect their health? Like, what are the symptoms that they experience before their populations actually decline, and how does all of this affect their ability to provide pollination services in urban agriculture? This question of how organisms move through cities is one that I keep coming back to and that I think is fascinating. Like, there's been some great research in mammals and lizards, like in some vertebrates, looking at what constitutes a barrier to movement, even in some birds, but not really in insects. We know very little about how they actually move through an urban environment, how, what stops them from going from point A to point B, how do they get from one resource to the next. And so that's something that I think is particularly fascinating and that I hope my lab will be able to weigh in on to some extent. To delve into that more, and I think that that's the way a lot of good and interesting directions and questions come about is not stuff that necessarily I'm fascinated by in advance, but that different people bring to the lab questions that they have that we might then be able to collectively weigh in on. One reason to care about effects of urbanization on natural ecosystems is just the fact that we are so fully reliant on ecosystems that are still outside of urban areas. And then I think the second angle is ecology isn't just outside of cities. So it's not just the effect of cities on less disturbed natural ecosystems, but it's also on, how is ecology working within the city? Because even the little natural areas and the ecological processes that continue inside cities, like decomposition, like, trees purifying the air and the rainwater and all of those things hugely affect our quality of life. So anything that we can know about how those functions work and how we might be able to plan cities to make them work better and enhance quality of life, then that is something I would care about, and I think probably most urban residents would. So that's what I would say to try and convince them.